Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're venturing into something quite specific, gelotophobia.
That's right, the fear of being laughed at.
And, while most of us aren't exactly keen on being laughed at, for some people this is, well, it's a really significant, almost dominating fear.
Exactly. It's not just a mild preference.
We've got a fascinating source here that really lays out the landscape of gelotophobia. Our mission, as always, is to dive deep and really understand the condition based on this material.
And what's interesting right from the start, I think, is how it was first identified. We're talking back in 1996 with a German psychotherapist, Michael Kitz.
Okay, what did he notice?
Well, he observed patients who were just intensely preoccupied with being laughed at, constantly scanning their environment, looking for any sign of ridicule.
Like hypervigilant.
Very much so. And they also seemed to hold this deep-seated feeling that they were sort of inherently ridiculous themselves.
Wow. So not just worried about a specific joke, but a fundamental sense of being laughable.
That seems to be the core of it. But it gets even more, well, peculiar. Titzi described this really unusual physical response he called the Pinocchio syndrome.
Pinocchio syndrome.
Yeah.
Okay, tell us about that.
Yeah, it's quite striking. He noticed when these individuals felt they were being laughed at, their movements would become stiff, awkward, almost wooden, like a puppet.
A physical manifestation of that fear.
Absolutely. A really visible sign of that intense internal anxiety and self-consciousness. And these initial observations, these clinical insights, they weren't just left as anecdotes.
Right.
They actually formed the basis for developing a model. Trying to understand the potential causes and the consequences of gelotophobia, it really set the stage for more systematic study.
Okay, so it moved from clinical observation to a framework for research.
Yeah.
Let's get into those proposed causes then.
Sure.
The model suggests it's not just one thing, right? It can stem from different life stages.
Exactly. It outlines a sort of potential developmental pathway. In infancy, for instance, it points towards something called primary shame.
Primary shame.
Yeah, potentially arising if that early interpersonal bridge, the infant-caregiver bond, isn't securely established, maybe through unsupportive or inconsistent interactions.
Okay, so very early experiences can lay a foundation.
Potentially, yes.
Huh.
Then, moving into childhood and adolescence, the focus shifts more towards repeated traumatic experiences.
Like bullying.
Definitely bullying, but also just generally not being taken seriously or being frequently ridiculed. And of course, now we also have to consider things like cyberbullying, which adds another layer.
Right, the digital dimension.
And then even in adulthood, the model suggests that a single really intense traumatic incident of being laughed at or publicly mocked could be enough to trigger it.
It really paints a picture of how vulnerability to ridicule can develop over time. So what about the impact? If someone develops this fear, how does it, play out in their lives? What are the consequences?
They can be pretty significant, quite far-reaching. One obvious one is social withdrawal. To avoid the possibility of ridicule, they might just pull back from social situations altogether.
Isolate themselves.
Yes. And sometimes, as a kind of defense maybe, they can come across as quite humorless. Or even, as the source puts it, cold as ice.
Trying to appear unaffected.
Perhaps. Or just genuinely finding it hard to engage with humor. And then there are the psychosomatic symptoms, which are quite real.
Physical effects.
Yeah, things like blushing easily, tension headaches, maybe trembling, dizziness, even problems with sleep. Their body is reacting to that psychological stress.
And that Pinocchio syndrome you mentioned, that physical stiffness, that's also a consequence, right?
Exactly. It's part of the picture. Those clumsy sort of wooden movements, an agelotic face, which means quite expressionless, giving that overall wooden puppet appearance when they feel under scrutiny.
It sounds quite debilitating.
It really can be. Beyond the physical, there's often a noticeable lack of, well, liveliness, spontaneity, joy. They struggle to see humor and laughter as relaxing, positive social experiences.
So it fundamentally changes their relationship with something most people find enjoyable.
Precisely. And in some cases, if they feel they are being laughed at, it doesn't just cause anxiety, it can actually flip into anger, sometimes quite intense anger, potentially even leading to aggressive reactions towards the perceived source of the laughter.
Wow. Okay, so it's really complex, not just anxiety, but potential anger too.
Yeah.
You mentioned the initial model was revised and expanded. How did the research evolve?
Yeah, researchers built on that foundation. A big step was developing ways to actually measure gelotophobia more objectively.
Wow.
The Gelo-PH15 is the main tool here.
Gelo-PH15.
It's a 15-item questionnaire. Basically, it assesses someone's subjective fear of being laughed at. And the really significant thing is, using this tool, studies have shown gelotophobia isn't just something found in therapy clients.
It's more widespread.
Yes, it seems to exist on a spectrum within the general population. They found this across all continents and languages studied so far, which is pretty remarkable.
Across cultures.
Mm-hmm. Though the prevalence rates do seem to vary, some countries report higher levels than others.
That's interesting in itself. Does the source offer any ideas why that might be?
It mentions sociologist Christy Davies. He had a theory connecting it to social structure.
Okay.
He predicted you'd find higher rates of gelotophobia in societies that are more hierarchically organized, places where shame is used more overtly as a tool for social control.
Ah, so the cultural weight of ridicule might be heavier in some places.
That's the idea. If being shamed or laughed at has bigger social consequences, the feel of it might become more pronounced.
Makes sense. And this research using the Gelotophobia scales, it also found links to other conditions.
It did. It confirmed that, yes, you find gelotophobia outside of therapy settings, but also that higher scores sometimes show up in individuals with Asperger's syndrome or certain personality disorders like those in Cluster A.
Suggesting some overlap, perhaps?
Possibly shared vulnerabilities, maybe in social processing or anxiety management. And it's not just an adult thing either. They've adapted these tools to study the fear in kids and adolescents, too.
So it can manifest quite early. Let's dig into the emotional side more. It's clearly about fear, but you mentioned shame, too.
Right. The emotional profile is quite distinct. Typically low levels of reported joy, high levels of fear, and significantly high levels of shame.
Shame seems really key.
It does. There's even a suggestion that if the amount of shame someone feels in a typical week starts to outweigh the amount of joy they experience, their likelihood of developing gelotophobia goes up quite a bit.
That's a stark imbalance.
Isn't it? And alongside that, people with gelotophobia often report difficulties regulating their emotions generally. They might be more susceptible to negative moods and tend to suppress their own feelings, maybe avoid sharing them.
Which probably feeds back into the isolation.
Very likely. And it creates real problems in social situations, especially around humor.
How so?
Well, a really key characteristic seems to be a difficulty in telling the difference between playful, lighthearted teasing and actual malicious ridicule, like bullying.
Ah, so they can't easily distinguish friendly banter from an attack.
Exactly. A harmless joke might land as hostile, making them feel targeted or bullied, even when that wasn't the intent at all. You can see how many misunderstandings that could cause.
Definitely. It's like their radar for social threat around laughter is permanently dialed way up.
Mm.
What about broader personality traits? Does gelotophobia tend to correlate with certain personality types?
Yes, research using standard models like Eysenck's PEN or the Big Five consistently finds links. Strong correlations with introversion preferring solitude and neuroticism, that tendency towards negative emotions like anxiety and worry.
Okay, that fits the picture of social withdrawal and anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Some older scales also showed higher scores on psychoticism, which in this context relates more to being perhaps less conforming, a bit socially detached, and other assessments like the dimensional assessment of personality pathology.
Right.
They suggest individuals with this fear tend towards social avoidance, being submissive in interactions, and experiencing identity problems. Social withdrawal and suspiciousness seem to be particularly strong predictors.
So maybe reserved, anxious, perhaps a bit distrustful of others' intentions?
That seems to be the general pattern emerging from the research, and this links into how they see themselves too, particularly their own abilities.
How does the fear affect their self-perception?
It's quite striking, actually. They consistently tend to underestimate their potential and what they've actually achieved. They often see themselves as less capable or virtuous than other people see them.
Really?
Yes. There was even one study looking at intelligence. Individuals with high gelotophobia consistently and significantly underestimated their own IQ scores compared to the actual results.
Wow. A real disconnect between their internal self-assessment and reality.
It seems so. And you can imagine how that might create a cycle, right? Feeling inadequate could fuel the fear of being found out and ridiculed.
Yeah, absolutely. What about their own experience of laughter? Is it ever positive for them?
Generally, no. Laughter directed at them is obviously negative. But even just witnessing others laugh doesn't seem to give them that mood lift or cheerful feeling that many people get.
So even ambient laughter isn't necessarily pleasant.
Doesn't seem to be. And here's another interesting disconnect. They often perceive their own attempts at humor as being awkward or inept.
But are they?
Well, when researchers actually analyzed their ability to make witty remarks, there was no significant difference compared to people without the fear.
So they can be witty, they just don't believe they are.
Pretty much. It points again to that negative self-perception and perhaps a difficulty in recognizing or experiencing positive social feedback loops around humor.
Fascinating. The source also briefly mentions some related concepts, doesn't it?
Yeah, just touches on them. Gelotophilia, which is the opposite, actually enjoying being laughed at, and
Mhm.
catagelasticism, which is enjoying laughing at others, contrasting phenomena.
Right.
And it also notes associated feelings often found alongside gelotophobia, like emotional insecurity, an inferiority complex, maybe even self-contempt, things that fit with the overall picture.
It really is a complex constellation of fears, emotions, and self-perceptions. Now, changing tack slightly, the source brings up something called political gelotophobia. What's that about?
It's an interesting, maybe more speculative idea. Political scientist Paul Lewis suggested that the fear of being mocked publicly, or maybe the fear of being bad at using mockery against opponents, could actually shape how political candidates run their campaigns.
Influencing political strategy.
Potentially, maybe leading to more aggressive tactics to preempt ridicule or trying very hard to appear immune to jokes. And then there's Christy Davies again.
The sociologist.
Yes, with a more satirical observation. He humorously linked baldness in losing UK election candidates, seeing it as a kind of visible vulnerability to ridicule with a fear of being laughed at, which he then linked to a fear of disorder and therefore a preference for absolutism.
Okay, that sounds a bit tongue-in-cheek.
Oh, I think it definitely is. But it's a kind of pointed humor, suggesting how anxieties about social standing and ridicule might, just maybe, connect to broader attitudes, even political ones.
An intriguing thought, even if satirical. Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways we should hold on to about gelotophobia?
Well, I think the key things are it's a distinct fear, the fear of being laughed at, not just general shyness.
Mm.
It seems to have identifiable causes, often rooted in early experiences or later trauma.
Right.
It has clear consequences impacting social life, emotional well-being, even physical health. It exists on a spectrum across the general population and cultures.
And it's linked to specific emotional patterns.
Exactly. Low joy, high fear, high shame. And certain personality traits like introversion and neuroticism, plus that tendency to underestimate oneself. And crucially, that difficulty navigating social humor, distinguishing playfulness from malice.
Okay, so considering just how deeply this fear of being laughed at can affect people, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. If we understand gelotophobia better, how might that change how we communicate, how we interact socially? Could it even make us rethink societal structures that sometimes use shame or ridicule as a form of control? Something to consider about the power of laughter, its ability to connect, but also its potential for some to deeply isolate.